I was now possessed by paranoia. My vision was blurry. I was completely paralyzed. I remember hearing my mother freaking out and calling my name and asking what was wrong. I then remember seeing nothing. Not black, nor white, just nothing. I saw nothingness. I then had a whiteout. I saw whiteness everywhere, whether my eyes were open or closed. I saw my mother holding my limp body and crying. She said she thought I had died. I initially woke up with the thought of taking a psychedelic on that day. All other days where I woke up like this ended up with a spectacular trip. I was planning on taking a psychedelic to celebrate the successful completion of a 7-week spiritual working. I had abstained from all drugs for more than a month. The day started out as very gloomy and rainy. Don't get me wrong, I love rain. But this day was dark, cold, and rainy. My plan was to take the psychedelic outdoors, in some park away from people. I was originally torn between 2CT7 and mushrooms, both of which I never tried before. In the evening the sky cleared, but it remained too cold to allow for an outdoor trip. So I chose the mushrooms for their shorter duration, and for the fact that I could easily procure more if this trip was bad. And the dose of 2CT7 that I had could very well be the last 25 milligrams of 2CT7 that I will ever see. Therefore I decided to save the T7 for a perfect occasion. The problem is that I underestimated the mushrooms, for 2 reasons. The first being that I imagined, due to my spiritual background and my experiences with the sacred DPT, that it would be hard for me to have a bad trip since DPT is a mammoth of a psychedelic, which I could handle very well, and the people I know who took mushrooms seemed to imply that it was a rather easy trip. The second reason was that I didn't think that 3.5 grams of mushrooms would do much to me, since I've had a high natural tolerance to all tryptamines I tried. I live with my parents who would not appreciate their son doing drugs. They are aware of my spiritual practices and are tolerant of them, so I had that on my side. I'd always been able to take psychedelics with or without their presence, and get away with it without them suspecting that I was under the influence. This happened in that the psychedelic is either short-acting, like DPT, or long-acting, but does not cause much impairment or confusion, like 2CE. Almost 2 years before this experience, I took 500 morning glory seeds on one occasion and went into a severe vomiting fit that scared me and turned my trip very bad. I eventually had to turn to my parents for emotional help, and I was lucky they were understanding when I explained that it was a part of my spiritual progress. Do not underestimate the importance of a trip sitter. I found parents are not very good at this role. In my morning glory seeds experience, I managed to somehow convince them that I was not poisoned. As you will find out in this report, I put my parents in a very stressful situation, and I feel it was very selfish of me to do so. The 3.5 grams were made up of 4 stems, 1 cap, and 1 unopened cap attached to one of the stems. They all had blue stains on them. They were all eaten in 10 minutes. They didn't smell bad at all, somewhat exotic. The taste wasn't very encouraging, but bearable. I actually felt an alert as I finished eating the last stem. I walked around. I was beginning to notice that movement was becoming more fluid. I then had a meal, which took me 45 minutes into the trip. I was now feeling definitely off baseline. From then on, I began developing some anxiety. As time progressed, I became a little uncoordinated, and the anxiety grew. I really did not know why I was having so much anxiety. The psychedelic effects were not new to me at all. Yet I was actually scared. A big thing my mind fixed on was that my mother would be able to tell that I was on drugs because of my lack of coordination, and as my thoughts were beginning to get jumbled, I imagined I wouldn't be able to interact clearly with her. I decided to take 0.5 milligrams of alprazolam because I was now sure that I was bound for a bad trip. I didn't care if it diminished the psychedelic effects. I was just desperate to get out of this discomfort. I then went to lie down. I was shivering. I didn't know if it was the cold or my anxiety. I went under the covers, but I still shivered severely. I was not intensely tripping. I was simply very confused and had irrational anxiety, and I didn't like it. I was also feeling an uncomfortable body load that reminded me a lot of 5-MeO-DMT, and I didn't like it. With that, and despite the alprazolam, the anxiety grew and grew. I figure I was now at the 2-hour mark. I was experiencing nothing but pure terror. I was literally afraid of everything, including myself. Actually, the one thing that frightened me most was fear itself. I had no real reason to be afraid, and yet I was. It certainly was not ego death that scared me. I had my ego dissolved in the divine ocean of milk on DPT, while the world shattered many times before, and I have taken on other alien personalities on ketamine at one point. Therefore, I knew my fear was not out of some kind of identity crisis. Yet I was afraid of being afraid, and also afraid of the fact that the alprazolam did absolutely nothing. Later, I learned that 0.5 milligrams might not be enough, even though I don't have much tolerance to the drug. I decided to seek help by talking to friends. I went on Facebook. As I waited for it to load, I looked at the window and I saw a matrix of multicolored dots. It was an interesting visual that persisted for a while. All the dots were mathematically perfect in size and arrangement. I also had a hard time typing because the letters on the screen all had a red electricity buzzing around them, and I had very bad coordination. I found only 2 of my friends were online and both were geographically far away. One of them told me not to self-medicate with alprazolam, since it could be a potentially dangerous combination. Now, I know that the most commonly used safe cure for bad trips is benzodiazepines, and at this moment, since I was so afraid of everything, I took his word for it. This experience of fear reminded me how pathetic I was. I told this to the second friend. He simply told me what a good person he thought I was, and that I didn't deserve all the crap that I went through this year. I found his comment extremely nice and started crying. I then went to lie down and cried a lot. It was a catharsis for a very bad year. Mind you, I had been doing better for the last couple of months compared to the rest of the year, which was a very difficult one. However, I have a tendency to suppress negative emotions. I am guessing that what this trip did was simply release these suppressions and break the dam. I experienced the year's worth of anxiety and despair in 6 hours. Now that it was about the 4th hour, I was lying down, occasionally crying. The time between hour 3 and hour 5 was a blur. I lost track of it, and I do not remember all that happened, but much of it was spent lying down. I did not listen to music since I was afraid to listen to music. I didn't get up since I was afraid of getting up. I remember crying a lot and feeling sorry for myself, something I don't normally do. The trip took a distinct sine wave form. I got periods of extreme euphoria and an opiate-like body feeling, followed by the aforementioned fear with a lot of shivering and tension. The positive points, though fewer than the negative ones, were very significant. I remember the first peak I was lying down, my body twisted, my eyes and mouth wide open, staring at the ceiling with a feeling of immense wonder. The ceiling was no longer a ceiling. I don't know what it was. Perhaps a white sky with multicolored stars and streams that kept moving. I remember staring at the light. A lot of green eye murals flew out of the light and swirled around it, all in geometrical perfection. Since I was afraid of closing my eyes, the few closed-eye visuals that I saw were faint and chaotic. After that euphoric peak came another fit of terror, and that was followed by a sense of this is it. My body felt like it was dying, and I truly believed that I was somehow dying. In fact, I think this is what the big problem was. My ego did not die for some reason. I maintained my ego as I lost control amongst a lot of confusion and anxiety, and I don't know why. Perhaps I did not want to let go because I knew I still had a long trip ahead of me and did not want my mother to see me in that state and freak out. I also needed someone to be with me, but I had no one to contact. My only friend nearby was busy that day. As I thought of all the people I knew, I became afraid of all of them and found I had no one to trust. And because my ego remained, I went into a rather psychotic state. I started crying and masturbating at the same time for some reason. Of course, the masturbation didn't do much due to the state I was in. I know for a fact that at this point I was just overflowing with love towards everyone, which is paradoxical with the fear. I felt like nothing mattered, but unlike the exhaled form of the same feeling I get with DPT after ego annihilation, here my ego was present and knew that I was going insane. And for the first time ever on a psychedelic, I forgot that I took a drug. Actually, I didn't forget, it just somehow ceased to be relevant. I was convinced that I was going to be eternally insane. This insanity extended between 2 lows of terror and 1 peak of euphoria. During this 1 peak, I felt God intoxicated like I do with DPT. I felt like I had superhuman powers. I had many twisted thoughts, including the idea of walking outside naked in public, because nothing mattered and now I have become God and will die soon. However, in spite of this insanity, I had a grain of reason left in me, and that told me to stay as still and as silent as possible, and that it would be the best way out. As these thoughts persisted, the terror remained, and instead of God, I was now possessed by paranoia. I stumbled into the bathroom because I needed to pee. My vision was blurry. As I was in the bathroom, I felt the same painful terror I felt throughout the trip. I was debating whether or not to go tell my mother. I figured since the original source of anxiety was my fear of my mother seeing me in that state, perhaps confronting her about it would resolve the anxiety. And so I stumbled down the stairs and into the living room, where she was sitting. I barely made it to the couch where I fell on it. I was completely paralyzed. I remember hearing my mother freaking out and calling my name and asking what was wrong. I then remember seeing nothing. Not black, nor white, just nothing. I saw nothingness. I was stuck in a moment where the divine and I were one. I then had a whiteout. This happened to me before on 2 previous occasions. I saw whiteness everywhere, whether my eyes were open or closed. Eventually, I came back. I saw my mother holding my limp body and crying. I told her I was all right. She said she thought I had died. The whiteness dissipated into many hues of different colours, and again the eye murals that covered everything quickly disappeared. It took me only a few minutes to recover from that state and reach a level very close to baseline, and I still do not know how this is possible. With most psychedelics, you climb, peak, and then slowly recover baseline. Here, I spent 5 hours climbing, peaked at the 6th, and quickly returned to baseline in almost half an hour. I suspect it was less from the drug action and more from the psycho-spiritual reaction. As I came to, I simply told my mother that I was on morning glory seeds, and it was not hard to explain. I was then able to open up emotionally with my mother. I'd had problems connecting emotionally to my parents for the past few years. I loved them, but could not express it, and felt very guilty about that. I was now able to very openly talk to my mother, and later my father when he came home, and I managed to talk to them about many serious outstanding issues. There were 2 things my parents wanted me to do for my future that I was very afraid of and previously could not do. The day after the trip, I found myself easily starting with them without fear, and happy at the fact that I am finally doing something that I know will make my parents happy after all they did for me. I would say that I have never felt so much fear in my life as I had during that trip. I really did not enjoy it, and yet in the end it was worth it. The only thing I regret is putting my mother in such a stressful position, but even that has shown me that she really cares for me. I had suicidal ideas before, and now I would never kill myself and put her in that situation for real. I simply cannot cope with the guilt. Although I said I will never touch mushrooms again during the trip, I now think I might consider taking them in a few years' time. However, they definitely deserve much more respect than they are given on the street.